Hi, I'm Han Brown, and thank you for tuning in. This conversation is live streaming on all the various social media platforms. We are all about older adults. It's time to bring on the wisdom and perspective of those who have mastered life. So please check us out on our newly named YouTube channel, Aging Media Show. This is where I will put all of my video podcast recordings from Boomer Living. Also, I will share topics on digital health, senior housing, senior living, and aging in place to help you understand what is happening in our world as we age. We will also be talking about strategies for caring for older adults and tips on how to live a healthy life. On this platform, I will feature guest appearances by experts to share how technology is changing our lives and, and what it means for society and how long term memory loss affects everybody, our parents and grandparents. So visit us on our newly named YouTube channel, Aging Media Show. Today, my guest is Dr. Alberto Espay. Dr. Alberto Espay is a professor of medicine, neurology at the University of Cincinnati. He's the chair of sections in the American Academy of Neurology. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. And in 2021, Alzheimer's and other dementias will cost the nation $355 billion. And by 2050, these costs could rise as high as $1.1 trillion, according to the Alzheimers.org. If you're like most people, you believe that amyloid plaques are the cause of Alzheimer's disease. The amyloid hypothesis is a leading theory for explaining Alzheimer's disease, and it has been used to develop many drugs that have failed. The amyloid hypothesis, which states that plaques are causing cognitive impairment, has been the dominant theory for decades, and many scientists have spent their entire careers studying this theory and trying to prove it true. But now, there is a growing group of scientists who question if this theory is correct or not. They found that while plaques do accumulate in the brains of people living with dementia, they aren't actually responsible for the cognitive decline. So, Dr. Alberto is here to share these findings. So, Dr. Alberto, welcome.
Thank you very much, Han. I'm delighted to be with you.
Great. So, aside from your professional profile, can you share with us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. I am a movement disorder neurologist. I finished my neurology training at Indiana University, and to become a movement disorder neurology, I went to Toronto, University of Toronto. Now, movement disorders is a field that encompasses neurodegenerative disorders, and that includes, of course, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other conditions as we have classified them. I have been in Cincinnati, at the University of Cincinnati, since 2005, and we have a large program for people with neurodegenerative conditions. And one we're very excited about relates to the idea that everyone is different, and that this is the first program that will, in fact, identify individuals for the biology that got to the disease they have, rather than for the way they appear to our eyes and the way they appear on examination. I'm happy to discuss that, but I'm delighted that you introduced the topic of amyloid, which has been an area of great deal of interest to us, for sure.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. So, let's bring everyone on the same page. What is so important about amyloid, and how does amyloid interact with what we know about the brain?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing to recognize is that amyloid-beta is a normal protein we all have. It is incredibly important for many functions that relate to the growth of neurons, to the communication between neurons, to the sustenance of neurons. It's just one of the most important proteins our brains have. And what happens is, when the brain is dealing with biological, toxic, or infectious stressors, this amyloid beta, as a reactive mechanism, ends up clumping together. It's a matter of fending off these aggressors to the brain. That process of aggregation is irreversible. So it really is not a process that can be turned back. It's a process that follows a thermodynamics, which is laws of physics. And the physics are that proteins that are soluble in their normal state, meaning they are liquid, that's the way that they can operate. They clump together and become solids. And so the transformation that happens is from functional to non-functioning. Now, amyloids are conceived as being toxic, and that is a leap of faith that we jumped in a little too fast and have never been able to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
I can show you. I don't know if you want me to do a little
Sure,
demonstration.
sure.
So I'm going to use, I have this is a clinics box, and this is, of course, one sheath. And I like this as a way to think through the amyloid beta, because amyloid beta is in a very fluid state. So it really kind of goes like this. But as I mentioned, if the brain has something that shouldn't be there, let's say a viral infection, in fact, herpes simplex virus is a cause of something that we currently think of as indistinguishable from Alzheimer's. So if this is a virus, for instance, then what happens with these proteins on exposure is this. It adopts a configuration called beta sheet that is so stable, it makes it irreversible. But it's also so stable that it's super hard for it to be toxic. It is the equivalent of a little tiny stone that's developed. Now, why we've been thinking of this as a toxic is because our concepts of Alzheimer's were based on autopsy studies. And in autopsy studies, this is gone, and this is all we see sprinkled throughout the brain.
Mm-hmm.
This is not normal. And so we say, gosh, this is probably the cause of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we started saying, if we can get rid of this, we'll be great. We'll bring the brain to health.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been done too well. The latest medication was the first to be approved by the FDA to do this. In fact, actually is not the first to do this. There are 17 other drugs that did the exact same thing. It cleaned this beautifully from the brain, but people either did not change or got worse. And in fact, many of the studies have shown that the most success we have with reducing the amyloid, the greater the atrophy of the brain shrinks. So it's not that we need to get rid of this, but rather we're now finding that we need to replace which we are losing. So we're losing this in the process of it becoming aggregates. So this is the consequence of the problem. The cause of the problem is invisible to most of us. We don't know what really creates the problem to begin with. But one way to compensate won't be to try to insist getting rid of this, but rather to at least begin the process of replenishing the proteins that we're losing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, so how does the structure of this protein differ from other diseases associated with amyloid production?
So this protein is actually a bunch of amino acids coming together. These are the unique structures, but they have to be able to operate in three-dimensional space. And that's why this is in this way, it is largely fluid, is liquid. All proteins in the brain that are functioning are in their soluble state. And when they accrue a conformation called amyloid, amyloid is a state of the protein. Once they become amyloids, they are no longer functioning. So the certainty is that proteins can only function when they are in their normal liquid or soluble, we call it, state.
Mm-hmm.
The minute they are in a different state, they can no longer function. So a certainty in biology is that we lose function as the proteins transform into amyloid. But what we've embraced is the uncertainty that as they accumulate in this fashion, they become toxic. We've overlooked the certainty and completely embraced the uncertainty.
Mm.
And the more data we've had about the way we're dealing with the uncertainty, the more we recognize it is the incorrect approach, because it is not bringing patients back to brain health. It is letting them be just the same, but quite often rendering them worse. And this is why this drug that was approved is so controversial, because the FDA could not say that the drug was effective. It could only say that the drug reduced amyloid, and the expectation is that in the future that could be good. But even within the time window of clinical trials, we know that patients aren't getting better or are getting worse. And therefore, there is no way that they can expect a future where reducing this might in any way be translated into a future in which they will actually be better.
So now, why are we just now discovering that amyloid plaques may be the symptom and not the cause of Alzheimer's? So, I mean, you share some thoughts, but what does it say on this new study that we might be viewing dementia incorrectly? And what does this mean going forward for public health research and clinical medicine treatment?
So let me tell you then what we did, because that's a great question, and it was the reason why we studied this in detail. So the broke that the straw that broke the camel's back, I should say, was the fact that in the largest study that the Mayo Clinic study did, it's a population-based study, they demonstrated that we accrue amyloid for forever. We are, as we age, the more we age, the more amyloid we accumulate. In fact, by the age of 60, about 15% of us have amyloid in our brains. By the age of 85, 60% of us have amyloid. So most of us will have amyloid in our brains. Now, that's the curve of amyloid. It goes up as we age. The narrative is that means we began the process of Alzheimer's. It's an interesting narrative, but it's entirely false, because the other curve to look at is what happens to individuals' cognition and overall function. It's actually flat throughout most of the first 15, 20 years. And at the age of 85, which is beyond a normal lifespan, at least in the United States, it's when it begins to start looking parallel to the curve of amyloid increase. If amyloid were really the problem, you would expect that the curve of amyloid increase and the curve of dementia would begin to approach one to the other. So the ratio between two would be close to one within a normal lifespan. That's not what happens. So what did we do to ask the question you just posed? We said, well, because most of us can have amyloid and not have dementia, we asked the question of every individual with amyloid in the brain already participating in the ADNI study, which is the largest study that has been done to understand biomarkers for Alzheimer's. It's now running for almost 20 years. So we took all 600 individuals that already have amyloid. Many of them, of course, have normal cognition. They were doing fine. Some had mild cognitive impairment and some have dementia. We asked the question, is it possible that the reason you can be cognitively normal is because you are still able to keep levels of the soluble fraction above a level of compensation? That the difference between those who are cognitively normal versus those who have dementia, even though everyone has equal levels of amyloid in the brain, is because they are able to sustain the levels of the soluble normal fraction of the protein. And that is exactly what we found, that it didn't matter how high the levels of brain amyloid got. It didn't matter how much of this got. The only difference that was able to be determined between those who have normal cognition and dementia was how much higher the levels of soluble were in the brain of the amyloid positive individuals. So that explained the paradox that we have dealt with for so long, which is, gosh, you get amyloid, and sure, there is a correlation. If you ultimately develop dementia, yeah, you have amyloid. But why is it that the correlation is so poor the older we become? Why is it that among centenarians, half of them have amyloid and they're normal?
Mm.
And half of them have dementia and have no amyloid. There's something else happening with them. So once we deal with centenarians, the data is mind-blowing. It destroys the way in which we have conceived Alzheimer's, because it no longer amyloid no longer means what we think it means. And now this study explains why that is. It finally gives sense to the idea that amyloid is just the end of the process. And if the beginning can be somehow harnessed to some extent, that patients can still rev up the levels of producing their normal protein, they can have a lot of amyloid, but they are going to remain cognitively normal.
Wow. Okay. So, so what is the timeline like for cognitive progression for amyloid protein deposits? What does that look like?
So the answer is we don't actually know how long it might take for somebody that accumulates amyloid to ever, if ever, develop dementia. It may be that it's never going to happen. In fact, I mentioned to you the age of 85 because it's an interesting age. By the age of 85, I told you 60% of us will have amyloid. Only 10% of us will have developed dementia. So there is a fivefold lower prevalence of dementia by the age of 85 than would have been expected on the basis of the presence of amyloid. It's a great indictment. And in fact, this was known in 2019. And the authors of that very important paper noted, this is confusing, we admit. This creates a problem with understanding the concepts that we know very well. And but it's important to explain that this is kind of like cholesterol. They like to use the idea that this is kind of like cholesterol. You just have something bad, and you need to act on it the same way. And how do we explain this? We cannot. But interestingly, we already have evidence of individuals who are normal and have a mutation in a gene that gets them to have more amyloid, right? Yeah. And have already given them anti-amyloid therapies, very similar to aducanumab. The medication was recently approved. Great success in reducing their amyloid. And what happened to those individuals? Well, only those treated with placebo continued to be normal. Those given anti-amyloid treatments worsened. They began to develop cognitive symptoms. And in some cases, their brain begins to shrink. So even in what would be conceived the perfect type of individual in whom to try to clean off the amyloid, which is people without symptoms, right? But supposedly at risk because they already have amyloid, and they have a gene that creates a lot of amyloid, that they would be the ones we would intervene, because then we would stop the development of dementia. In fact, we are creating the beginnings of the dementia by starting to clean off the amyloid.
Wow.
It really is. It's something that I think we need to move away from. And the reason I like our conversation, Han, is because, to be frank, we neurologists are very comfortable keeping things the exact same way we've done for decades. We're just creatures of habit. We are very respectful of our traditions. We think our forebears were giants and that we are going to validate each of them, because back in the 18th century, when our definitions for diseases began to appear, they were not out to just define diseases, but they were certainly telling us something about molecular biological constructs behind diseases, and they were not. So we're stuck what we call Alzheimer's disease, biology has no idea what we mean. No idea. There is no boundary specific around this concept of Alzheimer's. We've created it, makes sense to us, it's logical. So, Han, I think that it will be up to patients and advocates to say, you guys need to change your approach, because you aren't getting any better by trying to do the same approach time and again. It is the definition of insanity, according to some, trying to keep on doing the same thing and expecting that one day we would have it, we would strike success. We aren't. And in fact, because we're so adamantly convinced that we are on the right track, is why we ended with aducanumab. The approval was this idea that patients and patient advocates were saying something is better than nothing. And that's why we have this program. But if you look at the data, this something is worse than nothing. If nothing is placebo, half of the patients in the clinical trials on placebo did better than those on the medication. Placebo was better. So therefore, this is worse than nothing.
Yeah. I mean, when you say something is better than nothing, I look at that as long as something is not regarded as accepted or approved, because there's plenty of somethings out there, as long as it's in emotion, in clinical studies and so forth, that's all good. But when something is accepted, FDA approved, that creates a trust issue, right?
Absolutely.
It comes with regard that perhaps is in question. So we'll cover aducanumab later on. So I want to ask you, so does this research mean that we will see any human trials in the future?
Yes, we will. The study that we now the studies we're now working on relate to accruing as much safety and potential efficacy in animal models. So we're now doing rescue therapy in animals. In fact, that's what we're beginning to see, that not unexpectedly, when you have an animal model that has a depletion of the normal protein, because it has too much of this already there, and if you increase those levels, we're seeing rescue both at the cellular level as well as at the behavioral levels. You can see improvements in the animals. Now, the process of replacement therapy will be coming to humans. It's what other fields of medicine have done. Insulin, what is a replacement therapy that recently turned 100 years old. And so it's a great model to understanding that most of the problems we have are problems of insufficient proteins, not of too much protein. So we replace the insulin protein. Here we should be replacing the amyloid-beta protein, right? We've been focusing on this on the complete opposite angle, and not taking the answers we've received as indictments on our ideas, but rather on indictments on the trials. We think our ideas are perfect, but it is the darn imperfect trials that have not been able to tell us that which we all along have known to be the truth. So we think that we are probably 3 or 4 years out from the first in human trials of soluble replacement, but this would be the first demonstration, we think, of an approach to replace a protein in a neurodegenerative condition. Alzheimer's would be likely the first that would then help patients sustain the levels, or in people who are cognitively normal, in fact, remain cognitively normal. So this would be what we would call rescue therapy. It's not quite precision medicine, and I can talk later if you wish about the difference between the two, but rescue is very important, because even if we don't know what is causing the brain to churn that much amyloid, we could at least keep the levels of the normal functioning protein above the level of compensation, and patients can do very, very well. Obviously, we have to prove that, but the evidence indirectly from what we've done and from the study that I've reported to you recently published suggests that that is really the most sensible strategies. Almost too simple to think that this is taking us so long to come to the conclusion that the problem here is the brain is losing proteins. One analogy that you might find interesting that I have come to use to explain how we think about Alzheimer's. If you remember, Alzheimer's is defined by the amyloid in the patient's aggregate, right?
Mhm.
Well, in an amyloid PET imaging, that image is that of a lot of red. When you see a lot of red, that's telling you the brain is filled with amyloid. That's bad, we say, right? Well, that's the same. That's the same approach of a map of deforestation. If you see a map of deforestation, there is green in the background, but a lot of red in the foreground, and we never think on a deforestation map that the problem is are those chopped up trees. We never say, guys, if we just cleaned the chopped up trees, all the debris, that forest will come back to normal. No, we know that the forest can only come back to normal by reforestation. Why is it that we don't think in the same manner when we look at the pet? We see all this red stuff, and we never say we're losing brain. We never think about losing brain. We're just gaining a toxic brain. This amyloid is so toxic. And so in many ways, it's coming back to the basics. If you looked at it, it's just that the brain is losing something, and it's accumulated into what you could think of as just the debris of its former self. In fact, some individuals think amyloid is a tombstone of the normal protein. And tombstones can really not do much of anything. The problem is we've lost the protein in the normal state.
Wow. So all of this is in motion, and I guess, do you recommend that people start to monitor their amyloid levels early, like today, just in case they have early signs of memory loss?
Right. No, I don't think so. And perhaps the key message to people here is to stop fearing amyloid. Amyloid is not an enemy. Amyloid is not the central villain in the drama of neurodegeneration. Amyloid is not a cause of the problems. Amyloid is a sign that the brain is fighting against something, and for the most part, the brain is fighting quite successfully. Amyloid, in fact, is needed for the formation of amyloid is needed as the brain reacts against stressors, against invaders, against poisons. That's what happens. The brain really clumps up quite a bit, and sometimes when the injury passes, then the amyloid goes back to where the amyloid form is gone, but the brain continues to develop the proteins, and then it continues to function normally. Actually, one example of this I have to tell you is a great example of how we think. So if individuals that are normal have an amyloid PET, also is normal, no amyloid, right? If they are asked to not sleep one night, only one night, so a sleep deprivation means maybe as few hours as possible, right? And the very next day, we ask them to undergo another PET scan, and what's going to happen is that it will be abnormal. That there will be amyloid in the brains. So what's interesting about this is that if you looked at how that was reported, is that sleep deprivation is a cause of Alzheimer's. And it kind of rings a familiar tone. We all know that people with Alzheimer's have sleep problems, so it kind of makes sense. Maybe sleep generated the Alzheimer's. It kind of makes sense. But with the same data set, you can always say the exact opposite. You can say the brain reacted against the injury of sleep deprivation by protecting itself with amyloid. The amyloid was a reaction to the injury. And so, and why do we know? Well, because once these individuals start sleeping again, that amyloid goes away. So it's not that's the beginning of Alzheimer's. It's that our brains undergo a variety of injuries throughout life. Sleep deprivation, all of us go through it. And that means that all of us have had amyloid developed in our brains because of a bad night of sleep. It doesn't mean that's when we began to develop Alzheimer's at all. It just is a sign that the brain is reacting against something. That we have taken it out to be the cause of the problem is because we've conflated correlation with causation. And that's a violation of Science 101, unfortunately.
Yeah. So basically, there is no clear, proven, definitive correlation. It would just, what's the right word? Just formulated, and everyone follow suit.
Exactly. And so once we have a theory that we elevate to dogma, no evidence can demote it. The amyloid hypothesis is really not a hypothesis. It's a dogma because hypotheses are scientific ideas that can be falsified. If we cannot falsify a scientific idea, no matter how much evidence to the contrary there is, that isn't a scientific idea. That's dogma. And so the dogma of amyloid has permeated everything. That's why the FDA approved this drug, right? Because the FDA thinks that lowering amyloid is the way to go, because all of us think that way. It's a normal reaction to say, but this drug is so good because it does exactly what we want the drug to do, because amyloid is the enemy. So that's a belief that's so strong that evidence cannot compete against, and that's something we need to break away from. And I think that patient and patient advocacy groups are perhaps key to really ensuring that there will be a change, because as I mentioned earlier, we're very comfortable doing the same. I think we'll continue doing the same for as long as we can. It's easier not to change.
I'm just thinking out loud. Perhaps the aducanumab, FDA approved, to satisfy a need where people were looking for hope, promise, something to hold on to, maybe, But I guess as a result, I'm not sure if it met that purpose, right? Because there's a lot of mistrust. So it's interesting. So now, have you noticed cognitive improvements after being treated with drugs that lower amyloid levels?
Yes. Well, I cannot offer to any of my patients any of those trials, but the data from those trials is quite remarkable. Quite remarkable. I just recently published a summary of all 40 clinical trials of anti-amyloid treatments. 40. You would think, what other field of medicine continues to do the same thing and again, and continues to doing it because they think that the next trial will be the one that tells us the answer we've all along been expecting? No other field of medicine gets away with this. We do because of the power of hope. I would argue the power of blind hope, unfortunately. So yes, so amyloid reduction has been accomplished in about 75% of all trials. So actually, great success, meaning that most drugs created to lower amyloid have lowered amyloid. They have lowered so well that almost half of all studies have shown that patients have gotten worse. So when we think of the history of the trials, most of us think, oh, well, the trials were negative because maybe there weren't enough patients, maybe the measurements weren't sensitive enough. A favorite one is maybe the patients were too advanced, right? No, the studies were positive if we think of what is it that we wanted to accomplish to lower amyloid. It just so happens that the many, many patients worsened. And so there is futility, yes, in about half of it, but half of the studies shown that the patients are worse compared to placebo. That placebo-treated patients were better than those who had the active interventions that successfully reduced the amyloid. So we know that the evidence is there, and that's why when some colleagues say, "Well, you know what? Now that the FDA approved aducanumab, let's do the phase 4 study because that will give us the answer." And I say phase 4 studies will never have the rigor of phase 3. If the phase 3 data cannot tell you the answer you're seeking, why would we expect that the one phase 4 study somehow will tell us exactly that which was elusive to the far more rigorous phase 3 trials?
Yeah. So let's say if this theory is correct, what do you think the implications, are for Alzheimer's patients and their families?
I think that the expectation is that now we can see a path forward for true improvement. That if we change the language, if we stop calling amyloid the villain, if we stop calling the diseases proteinopathies are the term used, right? Amyloidopathies for Alzheimer's, synucleinopathies for Parkinson's, tauopathies for progressive supranuclear palsy. We have opathies for many of these conditions. Proteinopathy means the protein has gone rogue. It's become terrible. It's diseased. No, the protein is acting as a protein. The proteins simply polymerize and lose their function. They become amyloids. So proteins have functions and lose functions, right? So if we can change that, now then we can see things for what they are. If it's a matter of just saying, gosh, now with the promise here to people is that we can in fact rescue the brain by adding that which the brain is depleting. And that's why the correct term is not proteinopathy, but proteinopenia. Proteinopenia means a reduction in the level of proteins. And it's well established that in people with Alzheimer's disease, amyloid-beta is really low in the spinal fluid, which is where we can capture the soluble normal fraction of the protein. But we've just been paying to that, which is the aggregated form, right? So I consider these new research highly promising. I think this is the most exciting, most truly innovative, and the one with the highest likelihood of succeeding, because it only makes sense. As opposed to digging into our beliefs, is actually data showing us that no matter how much amyloid we have, if the levels of amyloid beta are high, we won't have dementia. So to me, that is incredibly exciting.
Now, did any of these studies mention what genetic factors or risk factors might be tied to?
So there are many, but there are at least 3 very important genetic factors that make the protein inherently unstable and therefore rapidly becoming amyloids. Those are 3 genes, APP1, and the other ones are called presenilins, presenilin 1 and 2. So those 3 end up creating instability of the protein, and this protein becomes quickly like this without the need for anything to, in fact, trigger that aggregation. So in those patients, the same approach would work just the same. You would want to give them as much of the soluble to prevent them to evolving into dementia, because the risk in them is higher, of course. It's just remarkable that we've had now 3 trials in individuals with amyloid due to genetic mutations, and all 3, 100%, have been negative in the true sense that those treated did worse compared to those not treated, given placebo. So the genetics that we have used, it's interesting because the genetic forms of Alzheimer's are conceived as the reason why amyloid is bad, because there is overexpression of amyloid. That causes the disease. It's not the overexpression of amyloid, it's the overexpression of the depletion of the normal protein becoming amyloid. And so you're still losing protein. So the idea, I hope, of proteinopenia, the loss of function, makes a lot more sense and is easier to correct than the gain of function. These very complicated treatments that do remove amyloid, but do so at great cost to the brain. In fact, 40% of patients in the aducanumab trials develop brain swelling or other abnormalities of the brain. So it's not trivial doing this at all.
Wow. Now, is there a link between gut health and Alzheimer's disease?
Uh, Conceivably, the so-called gut-brain axis is one that is telling us that there probably is a big connection between our environment and our brains, and the environment, as far as what we consume, ends up generating the type of bacterial populations that live within us, the so-called microbiome. And the short answer is we don't yet know what about the microbiome is good and what is bad for the brain, specifically as it relates to the types of microbial species. So we don't know that. But we suspect that there is a correlation. Now, what we know is that the healthiest microbiome is the most diverse, meaning that the more variety of microbial species you have, the better. And I think that's accomplished through a well-balanced diet. If your diet is restricted, or if it's heavily dependent on processed carbohydrates, the diversity of your microbiome is small, and that is a diseased microbiome. It probably will have detrimental effects on the brain. So I think for now, that's where we are. And eventually, it may be that once we reach a level of sophistication where we can understand the effects of an individual's microbiome on that person, we might be able to manipulate the concentrations of each of these through a variety of different methods, but dietary intervention probably the most effective to rev up certain populations that are more conceivably favorable for that individual, and rev down those that may in fact cause some difficulties.
Now, do you think that there are ways for people with a family history of Alzheimer's disease to reduce their risk?
I think so. I think that the risk that they have, either genetic or otherwise, it can be modified. There are lifestyle choices we all make that can make that risk greater or lower. In fact, even if you have a gene that would make that risk very high, you might have it and never develop the disease if you are active, if you have an exercise programs that includes an aerobic component, so a cardiovascular element. You sweat and pant, elevate your heart rate, and then combine it with stretching and weightlifting. If you can do that for literally as little as half an hour 3 times a week, you get the benefits of what no medication can, which is neuroprotection. You are neuroprotecting your neurons. Exercise yields all sorts of interesting biological elements, and among them are neuron growth factors. So these are sort of the fertilizers for the brain that are generated through the work of exercise. We talked about diet. The Mediterranean diet is, of all the diets, perhaps the most studied and ostensibly effective. And in fact, this may be a reason why Mediterranean populations, the rate of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases is lower, and the lifespan longer. Red wine happens to be good for the brain. That's part of the Mediterranean diet. So that's very helpful. And then coffee. Coffee turns out to have all many benefits. So coffee in the mornings, red wine in the evenings, and a Mediterranean diet through the day with good regimen of exercise. We see this. We see that families of individuals with a genetic condition that would render more vulnerable to developing Alzheimer's, those who decide that they're going to take action because of the risk they know and apply these principles of lifestyle changes, boy, they do well. They do really well, and some of them don't develop the condition that they would have in the past been considered to be unavoidable. Even a gene is not prescriptive. In the past, we used to think gene tells you what's going to happen. No, a gene is just a bit of a template but it can be changed by what you do.
So it sounds like lifestyle choices more heavily weighted as opposed to, it runs in the family.
Exactly. Exactly. That's absolutely right. That is ultimately the case. Every one of us has a lot more power in ourselves than perhaps we are aware of. And that power can be put to good use. There isn't anything prescriptive about the family history. Yes, there can be a family history heavy over anything, but you can buck that trend based on what you do. That's so important. And by the way, as I'm talking about and thinking about these issues, another aspect that I think is one we physicians cannot measure well is the extent to which you think positively or whether you're a pessimist. Now, that's a personality trait, I think, for most of us, but you can probably change a little bit here. But the reason I'm pointing this out is because in my years of being a neurologist for so many people, I used to think back when I was shortly, a newly minted neurologist, that I kind of knew what the prognosis was for everyone, right? Now I've done so much of this that I actually don't know what is in the future for anyone. But back when I thought I knew, there are certain guidelines where we can tell if a patient is going to do well or do poorly. And I remember this was one of my first patients in Cincinnati, 2005. I saw this woman who I thought everything I knew suggests that she had maybe 2 years to live at most. And she didn't believe it. In fact, she's like, I have so much that I have to do. There's things that I have to do for my kids and my grandchildren, and I can. Essentially, she was telling me, I cannot bother with this. I have just too much on my plate. I have a lot of things to do. That person is still alive and kicking. Is still alive and kicking, and we're talking about 2005 when I said, 2007. So she has taught me humility about what I thought I knew, but also the power of all of us in the way we think. We ultimately are self-fulfilling prophecies. We become what we think we will turn into, or we are who we think we are. And so, unfortunately, that applies the other way too. People who everything points in the direction that they're good, but if they receive a diagnosis such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's,
Life is over.
Life is over. And they end up proving themselves right, even though there is nothing that should move in that direction. So there is that power. We don't know how to measure it. We know it's there. It must be biological because it clearly changes. So that aspect, I wish we could somehow harness. But I don't know how, but it's just so important. And that goes to the theme of having so much power within us that we can, in fact, change the destiny that perhaps we think is unavoidable by virtue of our family history.
You described the woman that you thought had 2 years. It sounds like she had purpose, right? She had purpose in spending time with her children, grandchildren, and the excitement and that drive and the happiness that she has every day with purpose with her family and beyond. So that's huge. That's huge. And how do we instill that in individuals, right? It's self-driven, not given, but it's self-driven.
It requires an effort for sure. It has to be deliberate. It won't come by itself. It won't appear out of the blue. I think it requires a little bit of faking too. The whole faking till you making it is. I think there is a lot of truth to it. At some point, you fake it so much you don't know if you are faking it anymore, right? Because at some point, it looks like that's what you are doing and thinking. So maybe if it doesn't feel right, you just fake it for a little while, and eventually it becomes what you think and what you are motivated in doing. How many of us even know that when we begin our exercise, we would rather be doing something else. We just push ourselves. We just do it because we know it's important. Eventually, we're so happy we did it. So nothing that is worth our while is easy. If
Yeah.
things were too easy, they would not probably be worth doing, as we all know. So yeah, I think that would be a very important message, and maybe the most important of them all, to know that patients have in them more power than any of the medications we
Mhm.
can ever conceive for them. I don't think there will be a pharmaceutical company that could ever replicate the value of what someone's expectations of the future are. It's just too important and too powerful to ever be matched by any medication.
What you're describing is ownership of your health and your lifestyle, and that happened as early as you can, as young as you can, not when you're 60s, 70s, and so forth. It all accumulates, right?
Absolutely. But
Hmm.
it's never too late to change. Sometimes some of us
That's
are
true.
in activities that, or lack of activities that we've set ourselves forever. And so when something such as a diagnosis of Alzheimer's appears in the horizon, it's actually a time to change things for the better. It's time to rev activities, is increasing the engagement socially, intellectually, even if you don't feel like it, even if going out doesn't feel like it's what you want to do, do it.
Mhm.
Even if going to the gym is something that you would rather not, do it. Don't do it because it's easy. Obviously, you're doing it because it's hard, but because you know it's important, and it'll make a difference. So I have had patients that have never exercised in their lives,
Mm.
never, and they're doing it now, and they feel, gosh, I should have done this much earlier, feel so much better. And sometimes some of them have said, I feel so good, I know I have a disease I would rather not, but because I'm exercising, I feel better. So it's very empowering, and that's all free. There is no charge for that, right? That's all that you can dig from within yourself.
That's true. That's true. Well, I really appreciate your time. Gosh, thank you so much. Do you have anything else that you would like to share?
I just hope that our everyone listening to you looks at the new medication for Alzheimer with big deal of skepticism. The FDA approval is not an endorsement of the science; is an endorsement of our hopes. And I hope that no one will be harmed with this drug. I cannot give it to anyone, but it's important that we all are all educated in avoiding the risks that come from something that has no potential to helping us and much to harm us. And with that, I thank you very much, Handa. You've been great to have a conversation with, and I hope all of your fan club will be delighted with this conversation. I'm happy to entertain any questions via email or any other method. I'm delighted to keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. And how do people reach out to you?
The best way is via email. I'm very responsive to my emails. My email is alberto.espay. So it's my first name, that last name, at uc.edu.
Okay,
UC stands for University of Cincinnati. Yeah.
great. Well, thank you so much. Until
You're
next
so welcome.
time.
Thank you so much.
Okay.